Hello, my name's Alastair Jones from Cadence Leadership, and I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about resilience and how that affected my own personal life about 2 years ago. It was something that happened to me. So let's just start on the 13th of May, 2018. I was out on a harmless bike ride. I'm a cyclist, one of those mammals, a middle-aged man in lycra, and out with some friends on a Sunday morning. And as I was cycling along the road, I just had this most massive headache, and of course, I did what every normal person would do. I ignored it and went on and just hoped that it went away. And then, basically, by the end of another sort of few miles, got to the first kind of town, which is just outside Manchester, where I live, called Marple. I decided it really wasn't getting any better. I really ought to stop, and yeah, then decided to cycle home. So later that day, I found out that I'd cycled about 40 kilometers with a brain hemorrhage, which isn't really very advisable. This is the place where I ended up, for which I was incredibly grateful for. This is the Royal Salford General Hospital. At the same ward actually that Alec Ferguson was in at the same time. He'd been admitted for a brain hemorrhage only a week before. And here I was, lying down. You can see me lying there completely flat. I was told not to lift my head until after I'd had a full scan the following day, a full angiogram, uh, when actually it was found out the extent of my injuries. Fortunately, I was incredibly lucky in that I only had a very small bleed on a vein, which had healed itself relatively quickly and didn't continue to bleed. Had it been an aneurysm or anything worse, it would have been a lot more serious. But even so, this was a life-threatening injury. This was something that was going to change my life for a very long time, and one of those life-changing events. I was told that I would probably be in hospital for the next 10 to 14 days, and that I certainly wouldn't be going back to work for at least 2 months. Well, I just tell you a little bit of story about myself. I'd only just started a business 6 months before that. I just got going, and having been a chief exec of a national youth work charity for 5.5 years, and then began to building up my business and doing things through my network. I had just begun to see those shoots, and work was beginning to come in. And in fact, that week I was due to speak in Belfast on the Thursday, and was concerned about the fact that I was going to have to fly to Belfast. But yeah, I was told in no uncertain terms I would not be flying anywhere. In fact, yeah, it was very unlikely that I'd even be outside the hospital for a couple of weeks. Well, I made it my mission to get better. I'm a fairly determined person. Every day I did that. I did a little bit more after I'd had this full scan and had this full brain angiogram, which is quite a remarkable experience. But then I began to think about how I could get back into that progress of getting back to normal. Now, in many ways, as we've seen with this current situation, sometimes there are circumstances outside our control, but I could control the things that were within my control. And on that Friday morning, after the Sunday of being admitted, I decided this was a good opportunity for me to persuade the consultants to let me go home and get out of the hospital. So I got up at 6:30 in the morning, had a shower, had a shave, sat in the chair. You would have seen me in that picture in some sort of very attractive kind of prison wear, hospital gowns that they give you, those pajamas, and actually was very grateful to be discharged on that Friday. Spent the whole weekend feeling really not very well, just kind of on that kind of trying to get better, but also knowing that I'm really not very well. In fact, I felt quite nauseous most of that weekend. Now, some people might say that was related to the fact there was a royal wedding that weekend, but yeah, I wouldn't like to comment on that. But come the Monday, I was feeling quite a bit better, and I decided it was time to go out for a bit of a walk. And I'd been able to move around the house, but going for a longer walk was something that was quite a strain. So I just doing that 400 meters walk around the green outside my house took something like 20 minutes just to kind of walk on that green around the house. And when I got back into the house, I was exhausted and slept for a good hour and a bit, just trying to recover. But bit by bit, day by day, I began to get better, working towards the date of the 4th of July, which of course is Independence Day in America. But for me, that was the date when I was due to go and see the consultant again to get hopefully an all clear. So a few weeks went by, and each day I would try and get a bit stronger. I treated my going for a walk almost as a training regime, and actually through doing that, I believe kind of helped motivate myself and energize myself to get better and to get back into that kind of the normal flow of life, with obviously not doing anything that I shouldn't do. I wasn't allowed to drive, I wasn't allowed to cycle, for obvious reasons, having had a severe brain event. So on the 4th of July, I went in to see the consultant, and I was so grateful in that he told me I probably wasn't even sick enough to be in there that day. That I was gave me a good bill of health, and although there would be some fatigue that I would need to work through and gradually get gradually recover from, that I was all good to go. I was allowed to drive home, which I did. I drove home that night, and then I went out on the bike that evening, and of course overdid it, so I was too tired for the next few days to go out again. But that was my story, and yes, yeah, just incredibly grateful and thankful, even though something massive had happened to me, that I was well. So what has that got to do with resilience? Now that's obviously my own story of resilience and something that happened to me, and there I am in my prison wear pajamas in that hospital. Well, I'm very much an active person, so you can see on the left there, I enjoy going out walking that Stanage Edge in the Peak District there, and on the right there, that's me with my cycling club. That's in fact about a year or so before the brain hemorrhage, we were climbing up Alpe d'Huez as a club, and cycling in that part of France. But yeah, I love to be outside, and I love to be active, and doing that I find really important for my own well-being as a leader. And throughout the time I was a chief exec, I was involved and found that exercise time and that space through being able to process thoughts really incredibly value and helped to sustain me through my own leadership, and continues to as I continue to lead my own business now. So I'd like to introduce you to a model which relates to what I've just been talking about. And this model comes from something called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And this particular model has been developed by someone called Martin Seligman. And it's a really helpful model, I think, because it's relatively simple, goes ABCDE, and I'm just going to talk you through these different steps of it. So like many people at the moment, I had experienced an adversity. Now, for me, that was a personal adversity. Other people, we've had this massive adversity in the UK and right the way across the world with the global pandemic, where change has been forced upon us that we've been unable to do much about. And it's affected business, it's affected human lives, and many people have been severely affected from personal grief and loss of family members, which is unimaginable. But at the same time, on that scale, we have people experiencing such extreme loss. On the other end of the scale, there are those of us who have been inconvenienced because we have to stay in our homes or work from home, or we might be continuing. So there's such a big scale of what our adversity looks like. But obviously, in my own situation, a couple of years ago with this brain event, it was something that happened to me, something that was affecting my family. We then begin to have beliefs about those things, and many of us have all sorts of things, whether they be health events, whether they be to do with relationships, whether they be to do with work, being made redundant or something like that. And there's all sorts of different beliefs that we have around that. As a result of that, we begin to think, oh, well, I should have done something differently, or it's my fault for doing this, or actually, if only I'd done, and we have all of these different things that we begin to believe on ourselves. Some of which may have a grain of truth, others of which are just complete nonsense, but we believe them nonetheless. And as a result of that has consequences in who we are and the way that we think and the way that we respond to other people. And then through those consequences, we can talk ourselves down, or we can allow ourselves to get into a dead end, and we can allow ourselves to really begin to stagnate. And sadly, what Seligman says is a lot of people then stop at that point. They just get to some kind of blockage, some kind of barrier. We kind of have all of these beliefs about ourselves, whether they be negative or that how we got into that space is all our own fault. And as I say, these consequences are kind of they can almost become self-fulfilling if we don't sort of do something to address that. So what Martin Seligman has proposed is that actually, and this is the most important part here, is when we know that things have gone badly, and when we know that that it was an event which we may have had control over or we might not have had control over, then actually we need to find evidence that disputes that. So what evidence is there? So I was able to say, well, actually, I'm really well. Now, I'll say in a moment, my father passed away with a massive brain hemorrhage and had an aneurysm, which kind of a grade 4, whereas mine was a grade 1. Now, I was incredibly lucky. So the evidence there was that what I had was very different from what he'd experienced. Also, I knew that even though I'd set up my own business and I'd gone self-employed, there were other things that I could have done. I could have applied for more work. I could have applied for a different job. My family was supportive, and there was a group of people around me that were helping to support us in a network. So there was all sorts of evidence there that I had that helped to lift me out of that situation, but I had to find it. And then I was also able to dispute, okay, so I might not be able to cycle, but there are other things that I can do. So I'm able to walk, and I'm able to do Pilates, which was another thing that I discovered. And actually through doing that, I found a way of beginning to see what a new way of being was, even though the old me was never going to be there again. And that in turn gives me a form of energy and helps us to have energy. So when things have happened, for example, we might not pass an exam, or we might not get that job interview that we were going for, we then we able to dispute. We find that evidence that says, well, actually, we know that we have abilities to do all of that, and sometimes things just don't work out because of certain circumstances, but circumstances do not define the evidence. And as a result of that, we are able to find a new energy, find a new way forward. And at this time, in the middle of this coronavirus epidemic, then actually finding new ways of innovating, new ways of working, new ways of being, we can find a new energy. And as we begin to risk and try new things in the new world where we are, then that in turn will allow us to move forward and progress with that. Let me just quickly explain on a model before I finish how that works. This is something you may have come across before, but this is called the change curve, and it was noticed. People did some work around the stages that people go through when they experience grief, and change is no different from grief, because change experiences a form of loss. And you'll see going through here, we have the first stage is shock, surprise at the event, which many of us may have realised with the pandemic. There was a kind of a shock or even a denial that it was coming to the UK. That was the next stage. Even though we'd seen what had happened in Italy and in other parts of the world as it came towards the UK. So as a result, there's a sort of a sense of frustration. We don't know what to do when we were in lockdown. People were teaching from home and all sorts of aspects within the circumstances as we began to deal with that pandemic environment. And then what happens here, we move down into some kind of depression, a low mood. On that left-hand scale, it's about our morale and our competence. How are we feeling in ourselves? How are we motivating ourselves? How are we seeing that kind of going forward? And that does affect our competence as well. And when we're low on that curve, then that can be a real problem. And yes, although we can't avoid that, we really can't avoid that. We need to sit there, we need to understand that, and we need to reflect on how we feel. What we then begin to do is begin to move out of that by experimenting, trying new things, saying, okay, well, what could we do? What are the ways that we could do? And then we might make a decision, learning how to work in that new situation, feeling more positive around that, until eventually we have new practices and new ways of going forward that begin to integrate into our lives and that become aligned with who we are and the world as it is after that first adversity and that first event. So let me just put that into the model that we've just been talking about. So we've experienced some kind of adversity. So for myself, it was a personal health event, which fortunately I've completely recovered from now, and I'm incredibly thankful for that. But after that adversity, we then get into these beliefs of denial and frustration and anger and all sorts of ways of thinking about that adversity. As a result of that, then the consequences of that is that we can get dragged down. We lose our drive, we lose our motivation, and we can really get incredibly frustrated, and that can lead us in a low mood. And as I said, Martin Seligman pointed out, often people do get stuck at that point, and although there's obviously there's a clinical form of depression and with real mental health connotations that people need to seek help for. What we're talking about here is is something which is perhaps more temporary, something which we can do something about ourselves. We might not necessarily need to seek medical help, but there'll be those who would need perhaps even to seek that. The danger here is if we stay there for a long time, then we can end up needing and requiring more help and more support within that. And even we could begin to go down another curve again. So Martin Seligman talked about this dispute, this what evidence do we have? How can we experiment? What do we know about ourselves? What do we know about what happened? Is this a one-off, or is this something which is going to be consistent for a long time? And yes, the world has changed. The world is very different. For me, I had a different outlook on life, having experienced that event, and wanted to make sure that I remained healthy. And at the same time, I wanted to make sure that there were other things in my life and other things that were balanced within my own way of working. So we dispute that, and then finally that we have that new energy, that new way of innovating and looking forward, and that integration that comes through a new drive moving forward. So what is that for you in your business? What is that for you in your own work? And what is that for you as an individual? That process, it could be that you've experienced any number of adversities, and this coronavirus epidemic has thrown up all sorts of different experiences for people and loss, and it's really important to understand that change involves loss. We may not have lost a person, but we have lost work colleagues, or we might have lost a job, or we might have lost finances. There's all sorts of different things, and actually grieving that and having a chance to sit with that is really important. And another thing also that is a kind of key part of that is that when we grieve, we do that with other people, and in a time of social distancing, where actually we're physically distant from each other, we still need to be able to share that, and we still need to be able to get support and network from other people. But that's a completely other workshop that I do, as is a change workshop. That's something else that I run as well. But today we're thinking particularly around our resilience, and this is just one model and one way that we can begin to think at how we develop our resilience. So you might want to spend some time, just go through those ABCDE: adversity, beliefs, consequences. Dispute that. What evidence do you have? And then what will give you energy? What will drive you forward? And make a note of those as you're watching this now, or when you finished watching the video. So we're in a landscape of change where everything is changing, and I hope that this has been a helpful video for you to watch. Do feel free to contact me. All my details are here. You can contact me on Twitter or by email. Email address is up there, Alastair at cadenceleadership.co.uk, and Cadence Leadership's in all the different formats of social media as well. I hope that was a helpful session for you to watch, and do contact me if you've got any feedback. I'd love to hear more, or put some comments below, and look forward to meeting you or talking to you in the future.